And he'll have more later as well. Now, back to the State of the Nation address. According to the President, drastic change is coming to South Africa's power company, Eskom. During the address yesterday, Ramaphosa said bold and decisive action was needed. He announced that Eskom would be split into 3 state-owned entities, one dealing with generation, another with transmission, and then distribution. But unions today slamming the move, saying that will lead to job losses. The National Union of Metalworkers says this is nothing more than privatisation through the back door. To discuss, we're joined by chartered accountant and analyst Khaya Sithole. Great to have you with us, Khaya.
Thank you.
So something needed to be done about Eskom. Was this the right bold move?
Something painful needs to be done about Eskom, and it's always been the question of who's going to stomach the pain. If you're saying that the workforce needs to be cut, it means that the unions will then have to say, look, we're not the ones that need to stomach the pain. If you're saying that the only way to maintain this workforce and still keep Eskom viable is to increase the tariffs, it means that the citizens have to take the pain. And if the citizens say that they don't want to bear the pain of it, it simply means that it will have to shift to the taxpayer. Somebody has to step up and say that I'm taking responsibility for the Eskom crisis.
So which is the lesser of those 2 evils, in your opinion?
My view has always been that the lesser of the 3 evils essentially is a combination of 2 things. Clearly, the workforce is far too big for an entity that is simply not growing its production and output at the same range that it is growing its wage bill. You have to be able to address that particular problem. But also the secondary matter is the reality that if Eskom is going to keep a liability a profile of 420 billion rand in its own balance sheet, it will simply mean that the cost of borrowing in the capital market is going to be much higher. And of course, a part of that 400 billion rand has to be taken off this balance sheet in order for it to actually start moving towards some form of profitability. So the state has to step in and take some liability of this balance sheet. So it has to be a combination of a few things. And all of them are going to be painful, but equally distributed, the pain is going to be minimized.
Okay, so I think you've touched on the 2 big issues, that Eskom has massive debt and too many workers, according to many, even inside Eskom. So splitting it into 3 is a restructuring. It does seem like a way, maybe then you restructure, there will be job losses, but are those inevitable anyway, like you said?
So the first question that has to be addressed is there a standalone business plan for perhaps the generation business, where somebody can step in and say, look, we actually did a case study analysis, and then we said, if you looked at Eskom as 3 separate standalone entities, what exactly is the number of workers that they need? What does the each balance sheet of the 3 separate entities look like? And then we're proposing to the state that keep them separate because these are the particular advantages. At this stage, we do not know exactly what was the analysis that underpinned this particular proposal. So the key question here is that if you are saying that Eskom is a problem because it has too many liabilities as a singular entity, the question is, if you split it into 3, do you then nominate one of the 3 entities to say you're going to bear the brunt of these existing legacy debts, or do you then simply split it across the 3? If you split it across the 3, it sounds like a meaningless exercise because the sum of the debts is still exactly what you have today.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. Where would naturally the debt sit? In generation, transmission, or distribution? Because then that's going to be the problem child, but then government helps that one and the others can carry on. So
what government will have to decide is that of the 3 business units, which is the one that has the greatest capacity to become profitable in the short run. So if you believe that the generations business will be the one that can turn around in the quickest time, then that's the one that you don't want to have these additional burdens, because then that delays the process. So the one that the government says, look, this is the one that will take the longest to actually turn around, has to be the one that stays with the liabilities, because you don't want to then hamstring the other businesses that are potentially profitable with this legacy problem. So it's going to be a very difficult exercise. My suspicion is that the only practical thing is to say, if you're going to come out and say, I'm presenting 3 new entities, there's no point in you then burdening them with balance sheet liabilities on the very first day, because you're already compromising them. You're simply repeating the problem, but you're simply triplicating the cost of managing the problem. It'll mean that the state will then have to take a very hardcore decision to say, it is 3 separate entities that we're putting, but there is this 4th shell company, this 4th shell entity whose responsibility it is to simply take over the debt burden. What then happens is that 4th shell company will then say to these 3 entities, we've put you as a standalone entity because we expect you to make a particular return. When you make these particular returns, you then send these returns to us so that we can service the debt. So literally for me, the only thing that is sensible, 3 operational entities and 1 finance house, which simply says we are going to carry this burden of 420 billion rand, and we're hoping that the 3 of you are over a particular point in time going to then give us enough cash to service this debt. That's the only thing that makes practical sense.
Isn't the other way to deal with debt is to get a private partner, so they inject money, reduce the debt burden, then is it privatization through the back door?
Look, I mean, a traditional finance logic simply means that nobody in their right minds would put money into Eskom the way it is right now. Remember, the reason we ended up with this massive debt is that the cost of us creating these new power stations that are still not operational has been inflated, whether through incompetence or through corruption or through, a lot of things that we haven't been able to unravel. The cost of creating these assets has been so high, it has required us to borrow even more money to actually put it out there. So if somebody said, okay, fine, these things that you created by borrowing this 420 billion rand, how much are they worth? The answer is that they're probably not even worth 420 billion rand themselves. So the problem that you have here is that you've overspent to create assets whose net value is actually not enough to meet that debt burden. So you really need to be very creative in how you then try to manage this. So if we're going to take the opinion that these entities could potentially be profitable if they didn't have the debt problem, then of course you need to put that debt somewhere else and then say, let us experiment with 3 entities that could be profitable. And if that turns out to be the case, then in the long run might take 10 or 15 years, will eventually fix the Eskom problem.
Okay, so there may be some sort of privatization. He hinted at that, but you're saying not affecting Eskom because that just would be irrational. Well, what about the other things? So strong measures to combat corruption, the scorpions coming back, President Ramaphosa saying prosecutions must follow these commissions. Did he hit the right notes?
He did hit the right note, but of course some of us then remembered that he was a member of the NEC way back in 2007 when the ANC decided to disband the Scorpions. Now, we have never been able to understand what exactly was the reasoning behind saying that this particular law enforcement agency needed to be disbanded. Of course, over time we've now learned that it was getting too close to the politicians. So maybe 10 years later, now that you've seen the onset of state corruption, the onset of state capture, the ANC has now taken the view that perhaps the country would much better off. There is a dedicated agency that can do the same job that the Scorpions used to do. So of course for me there was a very positive move out of his side. The bigger problem of course is, will the new unit be sufficiently insulated from the political interference that you've seen perpetrated by the ANC and nobody else? Will this unit be particularly insulated in a manner that then says we can actually do the job that we need to do? Because if it's not able to do so, it simply means that he's buying time. He's simply selling us a pipe dream. And in 5 or 10 years' time, if nobody makes it to prison on the basis of the Zondo Commission, on the basis of the multiple commissions that we see here, or even on the basis of the disciplinary hearings, if nobody goes to jail, we need to be able to come back to Ramaphosa and say, you sold us a pipe dream yet again.
Were you very sad? I mean, looking at the Scorpions closing down, now basically being revived, but skills lost. How easy is it to build up that capability again?
The great tragedy of the exodus from the civil service is that the people that tend to be exiled from the civil service then end up in very good positions in the private sector, where people actually acknowledge the skills that they have and then they pay them the wage that matches those skills. It is very difficult to then get these people to come back into the civil service, especially if you look at the manner in which some of these individuals were exiled from the civil service. You look at a person like even Olisi Masana, as compromised as his exit was. This was a person who said, I'm willing to take on the job, and then we saw that 17 million rand bribe that was facilitated by Michael Masuta in cahoots with Jacob Zuma to get him out. It's difficult to get a person like that to say, come and give the state another chance. So of course what we're hoping is that there'll be some of those people who then say, look, now that you're telling us that there's a new dawn, now that you're telling us that we are going to be protected and we're going to have, the autonomy to do our jobs, we're willing to give the state another chance. But it's very unlikely that you'll ever be able to reach those high levels that you reached, particularly when the Scorpions are formed, and the people that formed part of the initial Scorpions cohort were actually trained by the FBI and even the MI6 in the United Kingdom. Will this new government actually then take that bold step and say, we're going to create the most robust crime-fighting unit that we can find? We have to wait and see.
All right, let's move to education. We have to talk about that because it's so important for the economy, for the future, where we're going. And people are pointing to this paradox that he's saying in 6 years' time, everybody will have digital workbooks. At the same time, we're dealing with pit latrines. Is this pie in the sky being overly ambitious, or is it right to do this? Think about the future, even while we're dealing with pit latrines.
Look, I mean, the contradictions that you see when politicians speak always fascinate me. So about a few months ago, I think around September, it was this president who actually stood up at a breakfast at the Sheraton Hotel, the famous Sheraton Hotel in Pretoria, and simply said that we're initiating this new SAFE program, which was to say that we're going to deal with the toilets conundrum, particularly in the Eastern Cape. A week before, his own Minister of Basic Education Education, Enzi Motshekga, had then lodged papers at the Supreme Court of Appeal to fight the judgment from the Bishop High Court that said to the government, your responsibility is to roll out infrastructure in poor schools, and you've got these particular timelines to adhere to. And the minister's view is that it is simply not my duty to do so. Her excuse seems to be, if we say, for example, a school needs particular infrastructure, she as the Minister of Basic Education cannot dictate to Eskom what to do. She cannot dictate to the Department of Public Works what to do. So she's abrogating her responsibility on the basis that she cannot tell her fellow cabinet ministers, well, here's the one man to whom you all report, being the president. So of course he should be championing that to say, if we're going to eradicate the pit latrines, particularly in the Eastern Cape, this is what needs to be done. So of course when he then says that you want to be rolling out the tablets within 6 years to all the schools and all the school children within the system, the first thing that I did is that I looked at the Department of Basic Education's own report talking about internet penetration across the country, and guess what, in KZN we're at 28% internet penetration. So then the question will be, give them all the tablets, what will they do with them?
What about spectrum? What about the things that we need to get internet rolled out to rural areas? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, there's a lot of things that you need to be able to get right. And the big problem is that these things are not unknown to the ANC government. If you're talking about the question of spectrum, if you call Sipho Masego right now and ask him about his greatest frustration as a business person, it's the fact that we've got this idea that ICASA and the Department of Communications communicated a few years ago to say a spectrum rollout is a necessity. It's important for the country. We have absolutely no idea why it hasn't been done. So there are all these things where they can put them on paper. The National Development Plan says these are the things that need to be done. And then you get there is this remarkable sense of lethargy within the government at large, where people say the policy is here, the framework is here, and the implementation is just never there. The big problem, of course, is that we lack an accountability mechanism for politicians in South Africa. So nobody knows what ought to be on the scorecard of the Minister of Finance, for example, or the Minister of Basic Education, which enables us to say to the President at every anniversary of the appointment, for example, to say, President, you put this person in power, these were their KPIs, they haven't performed, get them out of here.
Yeah. At least he's giving 6-year deadlines, things like that, something we can hold him to. And I hear what you're saying, that talk is one thing, action is a completely different thing. But talk is also powerful when it comes to investors. We saw the rand strengthen. How would you rate it out of 10 in terms of building the confidence that we need?
Look, I mean, given the nature of the State of the Nation addresses we've been subjected to for the better part of the last decade, yesterday was as ambitious as you can get, and it set the right tone. I think what you need to be able to understand is that there are multiple constituencies in the country. There are people whose primary focus is this man opening up the investment appetite? Is this man opening up the education system? Is this man being as open in his approach to to inviting as many investors as possible? If that's what you're looking for, then of course you got what it is that you're looking for. If you are a person that says that our primary problem are the social issues, and these are the social and the political issues that affect multiple communities, then there are parts of it that appeal to you. So I think the way he structured the speech is that he reached out to as many constituencies as possible. Now, of course, a politician cannot make everybody universally happy, but at least somebody had something to take away from that to say, look, he committed to this. There'll be a lot of people that get disappointed in the long run, but at that stage there is something for everybody to say, look, he's spoken to the issues that matter to me. Let him perhaps give him another opportunity on the 8th of May and give him another 5 years in order to implement this. Whether the electorate is going to do that now is a matter for us to see.
So good SONA for elections, but follow through needed. Thank you very much for that analysis. That was analyst and chartered accountant Khaya Sithole.